Tell me a bit about Bathhurst in New Zealand and your operations here.
Bathhurst is a publicly listed company. We've got 3 existing operations and a export project that we're just trying to get off the ground. So our existing operations employ around 100 people and we produce about 350,000 tonnes a year.
Okay, so you came to New Zealand out of Australia. When you arrived here, I mean, how different is the health and safety culture compared with across the ditch?
It's quite a lot different. New Zealand would probably be described, or it would have been described as being a little bit agricultural, and that's not a derogatory term, it's more of get in, can do, and the existing legislation that was in place really allowed that to happen. It was no real regulations. It was up to each operator to come up with their own operating plan, and that plan was put into place by that operator. So that's quite a lot different to Australia, where there was a lot more regulation and a lot more of non-negotiable type operating aspects that were enforced by the regulator.
So the changes that have been happening in New Zealand have flowed out of the Pike River mine disaster and tragedy there. Did the industry and did Bathhurst understand the drivers and the need for change? Most definitely.
I think everyone recognised that the system that was in place wasn't sustainable. It wasn't even the fact that there was the unfortunate fatalities out of Pike River. There was just a realisation that we couldn't continue on in the same way.
When those mining regulations, the new ones, hit your desk, what was your first thoughts?
The consultation process was actually really good. I know there's some of the smaller operators feel they've been left out a little bit, but we had a seat at the table, and when I first saw the regulations, yeah, they are very similar to what we were used to working with in Australia. So mainly in New South Wales myself, but with the Queensland legislation it's very much the same.
And what do you think the key changes that were made with the new regulations are, from your business's perspective?
Really, it entrenches the idea that it's safety by design. It means that each operator's got to go out, he's got to assess exactly what he does on a particular site and then assess the hazards that will be involved in carrying out those activities. He then needs to put in strategies in place to minimise the impacts of those hazards.
And so you saw these new regulations, you recognised them in effect from Australia. What did you do? How did you respond?
We already had a robust safety management system in place, and I suppose because most of our senior operators had come from Australia or from an Australian background, that was the way we worked. What we have done in the meantime though, we've now put in a formal review at each of our operations to see if there's any gaps between what we have been doing to what the new regulations are requiring, and we're also using that process to actually educate our employees, plus bring our contractors along for a ride as well.
So there was no weariness. I mean, businesses often, when they hear of new regulations, they think of red tape and they think of the government interfering in their industry. You didn't have those reservations?
No, I think that there's always been, obviously there was always a regulator, but I think the issue for the regulator was that it didn't have a set of rules to actually go out there and measure the industry by. It was up to each of the individual operations to come up with their own set of rules, and it's very difficult then for the regulator in particular to understand where those rules have come from and how they're being applied. Whereas now with a set of regulations in the form that we've got a certain part of it is decided by the operation to best suit their operation, but there are certain non-negotiables that have to be complied with. And I think that actually makes it better for the industry and for the regulator in terms of trying to change the culture that's in place.
So day to day, what difference has it made to your operations out there at the coalface, to use the cliche?
Now, at the present time, there's been no real interruption to our day-to-day operation. All we're doing in the background is doing a review of our existing operations to make sure that we are going to comply with the regulations as we move forward. I mean, this is a journey. There's no that you comply on a day-by-day basis anymore, because the regulations are written in such a way that you have to continue to assess the hazards that are involved and the operations that you're carrying out on a day-to-day basis. So that is a process that we're already commenced on, and all we're going to be doing is actually educating our workforce more and our contractors and ourselves in our knowledge of those hazards and our management of those hazards.
You talked there about the workforce and the company. The regulator, I guess, is the third part of that stool.
Yes.
What sort of what do you want to see from the regulator enforcing these new regulations?
I want to see consistency in the application of their interpretation of the new regulations. And I also want to see that they are actively involved in both consulting with the industry but also with other inspectors or other regulators to make sure that there is consistency.
And does the workforce, you talked about also involving the workforce in the health and safety culture, do you think that that's been an area that's been lacking in New Zealand previously?
It could have been. I can't say for other operations. I know with our operations, we haven't probably had the formal processes that we would have liked, where we formally go out and ask the workforce, whether it's on a daily, shiftly, or when we're starting a new mine, what they think of what the plans we're putting in place, whereas the new regulations actually enforce that you've got to go and do that. So I think that's a very good thing, and it's something that we're taking on.
You're talking about the risk analysis and hazard management work that comes out of the new regulations. Do you believe an operation of your size, have you learnt or changed much as a result of those processes?
We applied a very rigid risk assessment process prior to the new regulations. I think what they've done though is they've really brought them to the forefront. It's not a add-on to your business now, it's something you've got to do every day, and that's very much the way that we'll be treating it.
Do you think that the industry more broadly outside your own company has welcomed the increasing regulation, and do you have any advice? I mean, you're obviously well down the track responding to the regulation. Do you have advice for other companies that they're facing up to these changes?
Oh, just in the first part of that question, I think with risk management, as I said before, it is a journey. There's no sort of you finish this today and then you move on to something else tomorrow. It's actually, you've got to ingrain it as part of your operating system. My advice would be that it is actually big benefits in involving your workforce, your contractors, your suppliers in assessing the risk actually on your individual site.
What are those benefits? That's an interesting thing, an interesting comment.
Just the fact that your workforce understands what activities you think are going on site versus what they know is going on site. They see the hazards every day. They may not recognise them as hazards until you actually go through this process, and that's one of the things that we've found both here but also in my past experience from Australia, that a guy may sit there and do the same job every day, but once he's been through this sort of training, he then starts recognising the hazards that are inherent with that job and actually can do something about them on the job.
And because everybody is now part of a new health and safety culture, when those hazards are raised with management, I guess everything's taken seriously.
Most definitely. You ignore that at your peril. So I think one of the other important aspects is actually involving your contractor, if you've got contractors on your site. And most sites have some form of a contractor coming on and performing work. They're not an add-on, they're actually part of your business, and they have to be involved from day one right through for the whole life of the mine. So get them involved early and get them involved in actually designing the system that they're going to be working under.
And is that a challenge when you presumably have quite a turnover of contractors across a range of sites?
It can be. Obviously, it's got to be part of the selection process for any contractor coming onto a site. That's one thing you want to see right up front. How do they manage safety of their employees? But one of the critical aspects of the new regulations is that the responsibility comes back to the person that owns the site, back to the senior site executive. So it doesn't really matter what system the contractor's got in place. It's got to be made sure it's administered and enforced by the senior site executive. So you need to be involved in it.
And it sounds like it's a system, and it has to be a system from top to bottom, because if you've got new people coming in and off the site, you need to be able to deal with everything consistently and be on top of everything. It's quite an expectation on the industry now, isn't it?
It is, and it is quite scary. I mean, when you think it's got to cover everyone from a visitor to your site right through to the senior site executive. Everyone on that site is regarded as being part of that workforce. Even if they're only there for an hour doing a small job, they've actually got to make sure that the hazards that are involved in doing that job, even though it may be a minor task on the site, are understood and that they're being followed. And so it's a matter of trying to scale to suit the level of hazard to the level of attention that you need to apply to it. And I think that's one of the issues that we're grappling with, and I know a lot of others in the industry are grappling with how to apply that right level of care.
And do you have any advice for other companies or other operators out there that are grappling with these issues?
It I suppose one of the key things, it doesn't have to cost a fortune. If you involve your workforce, if you actually set up simple systems that allow you to assess your risks on a daily basis, then you'll go a long way towards complying with the new regulations. But foremost, you go a long way towards making your site a risk-free site or an injury-free site.
And ultimately, that's good for your company, isn't it?
Well, it's good for the people that are coming to work. I mean, we've got a moral responsibility to send people home in the same or better condition they arrived at work. But also, it's better for the bottom line. If you're not hurting someone, they're actually on the job for the whole of their shift. Whereas if someone gets hurt, even if it's a minor injury, they've got to go and get treatment. So it's not good for your bottom line.
Good for your bottom line. That's not something you often hear from industry when it comes to government regulation. They always talk about the compliance costs. Presumably there are costs also to you though? There
has been. To do a formal review at each of our sites costs us about $25,000. That may not sound like a lot of money, but I mean, if you're a small operator producing a couple of thousand tonnes a month, that's a lot of money. But there is other ways to do it. We've sort of thrown the net on quite wide. We've brought in a lot of people to give us a hand at each of our sites in terms of geotech risk and a few of the other really important aspects. Whereas a lot of sites may not have those full range of risks, and so there's ways of scaling it so that it doesn't cost you a fortune. One of the aspects that I think New Zealand is going to grapple with, which we have as well, is actually getting enough access to enough trained risk management professionals to actually give these mines a hand. It's fine if you're a bigger operator, you can actually have people in-house, whereas if you're a small operator, it's hard to get those skills when you want them.
Ultimately, how long do you think it will be before the New Zealand industry has a similar sort of health and safety culture and, I guess, record compared to Australia?
As I keep saying, it is a journey. I mean, I worked 30 years in Australia and came through from straight prescription legislation through to a more enabling type legislation that we see with New Zealand now. And that's never stopped changing in that 30-year period. I think it'll take 5 years at least before we'll actually start to see that this safety culture will be starting to be embedded. And by embedded, I mean it won't be just something that we do because the regulator tells us we've got to do or because the Act says. It'll actually become part of business, which is, I think, the big shift that we've seen in Australia.
And Bathhurst wants to be part of taking the lead by the sound of it.
Well, I don't know about taking the lead, but we definitely are operating under that way, and we have got a lot of improvement to make, but we are committed to that improvement. We are committed to not hurting people.